Ethan Carter pulled his heavy coat tighter as the icy wind seeped through the cracks of his wooden cabin. Outside, the darkness of the Alaskan winter swallowed everything, a vast, silent void broken only by the howling wind weaving through the towering pines. He had lived here for 5 years, alone in the frozen wilderness, where humans were nothing more than fleeting visitors in a land ruled by nature. Ethan wasn't running from his past, but he wasn't searching for a future elsewhere either. He had once been a firefighter in Denver, a man who ran into burning buildings to save lives. But one tragic event changed everything. A massive fire, the worst of his career. He had saved many, but not the one who mattered most. The guilt had clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape, and so he left everything behind, seeking solitude in the heart of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. His cabin stood deep in the forest, over 50 miles from the nearest town. Alaskan winters were merciless, but Ethan had learned to survive, stockpiling wood, rationing food, and checking the weather daily. He understood one absolute truth: out here, one mistake could mean death. Tonight, through frost-covered windows, Ethan watched as the storm rolled in. The temperature had dropped to -45 DFF and was still falling, a number even the toughest trappers would respect. This storm was going to last at least 3 days, which meant no one, man or beast, could be outside without risking their life. He tossed another log into the fireplace, letting the warmth seep through the small cabin. It was going to be a long night. But Ethan had no idea that in just a few hours, fate would present him with a choice that would test everything he thought he knew about survival and about himself. The storm had begun to rage. The wind howled through the towering pines, slamming against Ethan Carter's cabin like an invisible force determined to tear it apart. Snow fell in thick, swirling sheets, erasing the landscape in an endless blur of white. From inside, Ethan could hear the occasional crack of tree branches snapping under the weight of ice, but none of it concerned him. He had weathered many brutal winters before. This was just another test of endurance. He double-checked his supplies: enough food to last a month, plenty of stored water, and a well-stocked pile of firewood to keep the cabin warm for days. This was survival in its simplest form: routine, preparation, caution. Then he heard it, a sound so out of place that his instincts went on high alert. At first it was barely noticeable over the roaring wind, a deep guttural noise, almost swallowed by the storm. Ethan froze, his mind quickly sorting through possibilities. He knew the sounds of the wild well: the cracking of ice, the rustling of wind-blown branches, the eerie stillness before a storm's peak. But this was different. It was a bear. His muscles tensed. Bears weren't supposed to be out this time of year. By February, they should have been deep in hibernation, conserving energy to survive the long winter. If one was out in the middle of this blizzard, something was terribly wrong. He immediately doused the main cabin light, leaving only the flickering glow of the fireplace. Moving carefully, he grabbed his flashlight but didn't turn it on. Instead, he inched toward the frost-coated window, parting the curtain just enough to see outside. Then he saw them. 3 shadowy figures struggling through the blinding snow, a mother bear and 2 cubs. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Even from a distance, he could see they were barely moving, each step slow and unsteady. The mother bear, a creature that should have been strong and powerful, staggered forward, her massive body weighed down not just by the storm, but by sheer exhaustion. The cubs, much smaller than they should have been for this time of year, huddled close, their tiny frames trembling violently. They were dying. Ethan had spent years observing wildlife, enough to know that a mother bear would never leave her den in the dead of winter unless forced to. Something had gone terribly wrong. Maybe their den had collapsed under the weight of snow. Maybe a hunter had disturbed them. But now none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that these bears were running out of time. The mother bear stumbled, dropping onto her front legs for a moment before forcing herself up again. One of the cubs tripped, rolling into the deep snow. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had seen enough life-and-death situations in his time as a firefighter to know the signs of hypothermia. These bears weren't just cold, they were shutting down. A blast of wind sent another wall of snow rushing past the cabin, nearly obscuring the bears completely. When the whiteout cleared, Ethan saw something that made his pulse hammer. The mother bear collapsed. She didn't move. The two cubs pressed against her, instinctively seeking warmth. But even in the dim light, Ethan could tell this wasn't rest. This was the beginning of the end. He stepped back from the window, his breath visible in the cold air inside his cabin. His instinct screamed at him, "Don't interfere." A desperate bear was unpredictable, dangerous. Opening his door to a starving mother and her cubs was suicide. Every survival rule he had lived by told him to stay inside, to let nature take its course. But then he looked back at the window. The cubs had stopped shivering, and Ethan knew exactly what that meant. They weren't getting better, they were dying. For a long moment, he just stood there, his hand hovering over the door handle, his heart pounding. He knew the risks, he knew the rules, but he also knew that if he did nothing, by morning, there would be nothing left to save. Outside, the wind howled, the snow continued to fall. And inside the warm cabin, Ethan Carter faced the hardest decision of his life. Ethan Carter stood frozen, his hand gripping the door handle, his mind a battlefield of logic and instinct. He knew he shouldn't do this. Opening that door to a starving, desperate mother bear was an act of insanity. Even in its weakened state, the bear was still a wild animal, still powerful enough to kill him in an instant if she perceived him as a threat. But he also knew something else. If he did nothing, that bear and her cubs would die right outside his door. He turned back to the window, his breath fogging up the glass. The mother bear was barely moving now, her breathing shallow, weak. The cubs huddled against her, small and fragile, their trembling slowing. A terrible sign. They were running out of time. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. He couldn't let them into the cabin itself, too dangerous. But there was another option. The storage room. It was a separate structure attached to the side of the cabin, originally meant to store photography equipment from his old life. It was insulated, had a door that could be closed off from the main cabin, and most importantly, it was warm. If he could get the bears inside, they might have a chance. But how? He needed to act carefully. One wrong move could turn a rescue mission into a disaster. Ethan rushed to grab several thick blankets from his emergency supplies. Then he moved to the front of the cabin, cracked the door open slightly, and let the warmth seep into the frozen air. The wind hit him like a blade, stealing his breath away. The cold was suffocating, the kind that numbed skin instantly. But he wasn't focused on himself. He stepped onto the porch, moving slowly, deliberately. The mother bear barely reacted. Her eyes were half closed, her body unmoving beneath a thick crust of ice and snow. The cubs looked even worse. Ethan knew he had to act now. He carefully placed a blanket on the snow just a few feet away from the bears, hoping the mother would recognize it as a source of warmth. Then he backed away toward the open door of the storage room, allowing the heat to flow outward, hoping the scent of warmth would reach them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, something changed. The mother bear shifted slightly, nostrils twitching as she caught the scent of warmth. It was a barely noticeable movement, but to Ethan it was everything. She was still alive, she was still aware, but she was too weak to move. And if she couldn't move, the cubs wouldn't survive. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before doing something that defied every instinct for self-preservation. He stepped forward and picked up one of the cubs. The moment Ethan lifted the small, fragile body, his heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. The mother bear could attack at any moment. But she didn't. Instead, she watched. Her half-lidded eyes followed his every movement, but there was no aggression, only exhaustion. Ethan moved as slowly as possible, wrapping the cub in the thick blanket and stepping backward toward the open door of the storage room. The warmth from inside spilled out, beckoning like a lifeline. Then he placed the cub down inside the storage room and stepped back. Nothing. No growl, no sudden attack. The mother bear didn't move. So he did it again. He grabbed the second cub, repeating the same process, all while keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. When he set the second cub inside, he stepped further back toward the cabin door, his heart pounding in his ears. Now came the hardest part. Would the mother follow? For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. Ethan held his breath. If she didn't follow soon, it would be too late. Then she lifted her head. It was a small, sluggish movement, but it carried the weight of survival. She smelled the warmth. She saw where her cubs had gone. And then, with the last reserves of her strength, she moved. Ethan watched in awe as she dragged herself forward, using sheer willpower to follow her cubs. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion, but step by step, she made it to the threshold of the storage room. For a brief moment, she paused. Her eyes met Ethan's through the swirling snow. There was no fear in them, no hostility, just understanding. Then she crossed the threshold, collapsing just inside the room, curling around her cubs. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and shut the door. The storm still raged outside, but inside that small space, 3 lives had been saved. Ethan stood in the snow, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had broken every survival rule in the book, and yet, looking at that door, he knew he had done the right thing. Ethan Carter leaned against the storage room door, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, not from the cold, but from the realization of what he had just done. He had locked himself in a life or math situation. 3 bears, 1 full-grown mother and 2 cubs, were now inside the small storage room, just a few feet from where he stood. A decision that went against every survival instinct he had ever learned. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, the wind howling like a wild beast, throwing walls of snow against the cabin. The temperature had dropped even further, nearing -55 DFF, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. If he had done nothing, those bears would already be dead. But that didn't mean they were safe yet. Ethan remained completely still, listening. He expected growls, movement, some kind of reaction from the mother bear. But inside the storage room, there was almost nothing. Just slow, labored breathing. He took a cautious step toward the small window that connected the cabin to the storage space. Through the frosted glass, he could barely make out their shapes. The mother bear had collapsed, curling her massive body around the cubs. The cubs were still huddled together, their tiny bodies motionless beneath the blanket Ethan had given them earlier. They were alive, but just barely. Ethan clenched his jaw. The battle wasn't over. The bears had shelter now, but shelter alone wouldn't be enough. If they didn't warm up soon, the cold would still take them. Ethan moved quickly. He grabbed more firewood and stoked the flames in his main cabin, letting the heat radiate toward the storage room. Next was water. Even if the bears were too weak to eat, they needed water to survive. He filled a shallow metal dish with warm water and carefully cracked the storage room door open just enough to slide it inside. Then he stepped back and waited. Minutes passed. Then a shift. The mother bear opened her eyes. She didn't lunge, didn't growl. She just looked. Her nostrils flared slightly, registering the scent of warmth, of safety. Then, painfully slow, she stretched her neck forward and began lapping at the water. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was still fighting, but the cubs hadn't moved. Ethan's relief was short-lived. They were still in critical danger. The mother bear had accepted his help, at least enough to drink the water, but the cubs weren't responding. Ethan knew enough about hypothermia to recognize the signs. Their small bodies couldn't generate enough heat on their own. If they didn't warm up soon, they would slip into unconsciousness, and then it would be too late. He took a deep breath and grabbed another thick wool blanket. This was the most dangerous move yet. He had to get close enough to help the cubs without triggering the mother bear's protective instincts. Moving cautiously, he cracked the storage room door open just wide enough to slide the blanket inside. This time, he didn't just drop it. He gently nudged it closer to the cubs using a wooden pole, ensuring it wouldn't startle the mother. She saw him. For a split second, Ethan thought this was it, the moment she would snap, seeing him as a threat. But she didn't move. Instead, her gaze flickered between him and her cubs. Then, in a moment that Ethan would never forget, she nudged the blanket with her nose, pulling it over her cubs herself. Ethan's throat tightened. She understood. For the next few hours, Ethan kept his distance but remained vigilant. Every few hours, he placed small amounts of food near the door. He knew the mother wouldn't eat right away, not until she felt safe. But he had to try. Slowly, things began to change. The cubs, once frighteningly still, began to stir. Tiny movements at first, then weak attempts to press themselves closer to their mother. Not much, but enough. The mother bear remained alert but never aggressive. She was still too weak to stand, but the fact that she was awake, that she had drunk water, that she had accepted warmth, it meant she was fighting to stay alive. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire burning, watching over the storage room like a guardian in the storm. By dawn, the wind had died down, and inside that small, dimly lit room, 3 lives had been given a second chance. The storm raged on, howling through the trees, shaking Ethan Carter's cabin as if testing its strength. Snow continued to pile up outside, burying the landscape in a thick, endless white. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Ethan didn't move from his spot near the storage room door. He had done everything he could, but survival wasn't guaranteed yet. The mother bear and her cubs were out of the storm, but that didn't mean they were safe. Hypothermia wasn't something you just walked away from. The fight wasn't over. Ethan checked the thermometer hanging near the window. 52 Degath. At this temperature, exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Even large animals like bears couldn't withstand it for long if their bodies were already weak. He turned toward the storage room window, scanning the dim interior. The mother bear hadn't moved much. She was still curled around her cubs, but Ethan could tell. Her breathing was slow, too slow. And the cubs? They weren't shivering anymore. Ethan's stomach twisted. That wasn't a good sign. Shivering meant their bodies were still fighting, still generating heat. But when the shaking stopped, it meant their bodies had given up. They were slipping into the final stages of hypothermia. If he didn't act fast, they wouldn't make it. Ethan knew he was about to make the riskiest move yet. Getting too close to a weakened but still wild animal was dangerous, but if he didn't, the cubs wouldn't survive the night. He grabbed the thickest blanket he had and pulled out a thermal survival pad from his emergency gear. It was designed to reflect and retain body heat. If he could get the cubs onto it, they might have a chance. But how could he do that without triggering the mother's instincts? Slow, careful, He took a deep breath, cracked the storage room door open just enough to slip inside, and immediately crouched low, making himself small. The mother bear opened her eyes. Ethan froze. For a long, agonizing second, their eyes locked. Her body tensed, but she didn't move. She was watching him, assessing. Ethan didn't break eye contact. He didn't challenge her, but he didn't cower either. He moved slowly, placing the thermal pad near the cubs, then unrolled the blanket over them. Still no reaction from the mother. Then something incredible happened. She nudged the blanket with her nose, adjusting it over the cubs herself. Ethan let out a slow breath. She understood. With the cubs now on the thermal pad, Ethan backed away and carefully placed a small dish of warm water near the mother. She sniffed it, hesitated, then began to drink. Good. She was still fighting. But Ethan knew food was the next test. If she ate, it meant she still had enough strength to recover. He carefully slid some fish and venison closer to her. Then he stepped back, watching. At first, nothing. Then she reached forward and took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan barely moved for the next few hours, watching from the cabin window, making sure the bears were responding to the warmth, the water, the food. The cubs, once eerily still, began to stir under the blanket. Their small bodies pressed closer against their mother's fur, seeking warmth. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he wasn't foolish enough to let his guard down. The storm was still raging. The night was far from over. And even if the bears survived, there was still one question left unanswered. Would the mother ever trust him enough to leave peacefully when the time came? The storm raged for 3 long days, burying the wilderness in a thick, frozen silence. Ethan Carter had faced brutal winters before, but none had ever felt this endless. Every hour he checked on the bears, monitoring the slow, fragile return of life within the storage room. The mother bear had begun moving more, shifting her weight, adjusting her cubs. The little ones, once on the brink of death, now twitched and stretched under the warmth of the blanket. They were surviving, and so was Ethan. On the 3rd morning, the storm finally broke. Sunlight pierced through the clouds, glinting off the untouched snow, turning the forest into a vast frozen wonderland. The air was still frigid, but the worst had passed. Ethan stepped outside, his boots crunching against the hardened snowdrifts. The world around him was eerily silent, the kind of silence that only follows nature's most violent storms. It was time. He turned to the storage room and carefully unlatched the door. A rush of cold air mixed with the lingering warmth inside. And then, movement. The mother bear lifted her head. Her dark eyes locked onto him. There was no fear, no aggression, just quiet understanding. She shifted, testing her strength. Then slowly she rose to her feet. Her cubs, still small and unsteady, clung to her legs, blinking in the morning light. They were weak, but they were alive. Ethan stepped back, giving them space. The mother bear hesitated for a long moment, her powerful frame silhouetted in the doorway. She lifted her nose, sniffing the air, sensing the change. Then she took the first step outside. The cubs followed, stumbling at first, but finding their footing in the deep snow. And just like that, they were free. Ethan watched in silence as the mother bear led her cubs toward the tree line. Their dark forms moved against the brilliant white of the snow, a sight so surreal it barely felt real. Then, just before disappearing into the forest, the mother bear stopped. She turned her massive head and looked back at him. Not as a threat, not as prey or predator, but as something else entirely. For a few seconds, they simply stared at each other, two beings who had shared a moment of survival, a moment that neither would forget. Then, with quiet grace, she turned and vanished into the trees, her cubs close behind. Ethan stood there long after they were gone, staring at the empty space where they had been. Back inside his cabin, Ethan's eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of his old firefighting crew, taken before the tragedy that had sent him running from the world. For years he had lived here, believing that survival meant isolation, that cutting himself off from others would protect him from the pain of loss. But in saving those bears, he had done the very thing he had spent years avoiding. He had let himself care again. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter didn't feel alone. And deep in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, under a sky so clear it stretched forever, he smiled. Genuine, unguarded, and real. The days after the storm felt different. The forest, once battered and broken by the blizzard, had settled into an eerie calm. The world outside Ethan Carter's cabin was quiet, untouched, as if nature itself had taken a deep breath after its fury. But something inside Ethan had changed, too. Every morning, as he stepped outside to gather wood or check his traps, his eyes instinctively drifted toward the tree line. He knew the bears were gone, but some part of him still looked, still wondered. And then, one morning he found the tracks. Just beyond his porch, imprinted in the fresh snow, were the unmistakable paw prints of a bear. They didn't lead toward the cabin, only circled near the edge of the clearing before disappearing back into the woods. She had come back. Ethan didn't know if it was chance or something more. Maybe the mother bear had simply passed through on her way to find food, or maybe, for a brief moment, she had remembered the man who had saved her and her cubs. Whatever the reason, he smiled. It wasn't gratitude that he needed, it was the simple knowledge that they had survived. Sitting by his fire that evening, Ethan found himself staring at an old photograph on the cabin wall, a picture of him and his firefighting crew, taken before everything changed. For years, he had carried the weight of a loss he couldn't undo, believing that distance and solitude were the only ways to protect himself from ever feeling that pain again. But in saving those bears, he had done something he swore he wouldn't do. He had let himself care. And in doing so, he had finally understood something. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about knowing when to break the rules, when to take risks, when to fight for something bigger than yourself. And sometimes it's about remembering that no matter how wild, how untamed, how harsh the world may seem, we are never truly alone.